my little Luxes. Welcome back to another Scary Stories My Father Told Me, and I'm your host, charsieluxxx. And this episode is technically a repeat from my second channel, but I got rid of that channel, so I started moving all of those videos to this channel because I only want the one channel. I have ADHD, I have other issues and problems, and it just gets too complicated for me bouncing back and forth. I just want everything here. And you know what? Scary stories and talking about horror movies are so related to each other that I want it all here. But anyway, so I decided to redo the intro and just kind of give a quick explanation and say hi, hello, welcome. And it's been a long time since I posted a scary story on here, so I apologize for that. But it's a lot easier for me just doing the movie reviews right now. I'm enjoying them, so I figured I'll just keep doing that. But like I said, I wanted to get this one up on this channel, and it was the last one I needed to move over. So please come gather around the campfire with me and come enjoy this little spooky tale.
Lost Souls by Jeff Parsons, May 24th, 1944. The damp air smothered Hans with a slow asphyxiation of hot sweat, carbon dioxide, and diesel fuel. Each breath grew more and more tortured, not so much from the persuasive soggy drip of foul moisture clogging his lungs, but from the thought of what caused the U-292 German submarine to shudder, as if in anticipated pleasure. The U-boat was cruising along the surface in attack mode with other subs in the wolf pack. They preyed upon the merchant cargo ships that crossed the unforgiving sea from Newfoundland to England. Each time the ship shook, a torpedo was sent away through the frigid North Atlantic Ocean towards its hapless convoy target. Hans sat in the narrow toilet stall behind a flimsy curtain screen, leaning forward with his head cradled by his trembling hands, ashamed of his behavior, but unable to control it any more. He carefully eased a photograph from his uniform's breast pocket. Stroking the portrait of his love, Greta, he wondered yet again how he was going to stay sane. U-boat service extracted a heavy toll upon him. He winced yet again. Hans thought he could hear the harsh shriek of the enemy vessels tearing apart after each torpedo hit, but he knew that was unlikely, for the submarine's twin diesel engines were humming along at low throttle in the nearby bulkhead compartment. He had heard that sound before, the dreadful shearing metal sound of sinking ships, and it haunted him. Like being underneath a waterfall, thunderous bubbling accompanied the dying theros of a merchant ship as it cracked open like a fragile eggshell. The deadly water flooding inside and the sailors within, he swore that he could hear the sounds of their lost souls screaming, just like in his nightmares. Gott im Himmel. They were dying, he thought. Even if the sailors survived the sudden tremulous sinking, they'd be cast adrift into the freezing wave-wrecked water to die with little hope of rescue. Hans, get your butt out of there now, Gruber, the head mechanic, bellowed from the engine room. Hans sighed. He kissed Greta's snapshot and slid it back into his pocket. Standing up, he wiped off the sweat streaking down his face and left his safe haven. Back to work. The endless war needed him. Gruber frowned at him. Did you get lost? No, I just felt sick. Queasy, he lied. Must be something I ate. Uh-huh, Gruber said, tapping on a pressure gauge by the noisy diesel engines. Hans knew how lame his response sounded. They had just been restocked with fresh food from a submarine supply ship. It was unlikely that the food had been spoiled. He didn't hear the sound of torpedoes being fired anymore. Is the attack over? Gruber was busy starting the electronic engines. They were used for quiet running engines, instead of the diesels, which would be shut off before the submarine slid beneath the waves. No more torpedoes left. We'll have to connect with the supply ship again. Gruber looked up at Hans, then smiled slightly, not unkindly. Hans, this is what we do. Best get used to it. And don't let the Uberlieutenant or anyone else know about your feelings, okay? Ja. Thanks, Gregor. I'll do my best. The submarine had left the oil-slick scene of floating carnage and escaped unharmed into the vast rolling sea. Later that evening, Uberlieutenant Cersei, Herr Werner Schmidt, their commander, gave an announcement over the ship's comm. We have fought with great valor. Each torpedo struck a mighty blow to the enemy's supply lines. We have saved the lives of many a valiant German soldier. On behalf of the fatherland, I commend you once again for your selfless acts of bravery. Hans cringed on the inside. He didn't want to share his emotions with the other crewmates settled around him in the aft sleeping quarters. The crowded room contained bunks stacked 3 high, filled with crewmen lying on their off hours, too restless to sleep. The hypnotic tempo of water condensate dripping from the ceiling, piping, and curved walls encouraged Hans' mind to wander into places he'd rather not consider, such as the meaning behind Schmidt's words. Schmidt was right about bravery. Kriegsmarine U-boat service was dangerous. An encounter with an enemy destroyer was lethal in most cases, let alone the technical problems associated with repeatedly diving deep into the briny depths. The experience was unnatural. It took a certain amount of mental fortitude to be a submariner. Even so, everyone was always so solemn after a battle. Perhaps they realized that sooner or later their luck would run out and death could overtake them. His friend Fadi broke the silent gloom. He said, "Looks like we've single-handedly saved the fatherland again." Several tired smirks were exchanged at Fadi's remark. He smiled ruefully, then said, "I talked with some of the supply ship crew when their officers weren't looking. They said supplies were running short. No one was getting what they needed." Rudy, one of the pipe fitters, said, "Yeah, and they also said something else." "Rudy, no need to bring that up." Johann, another pipe fitter, grumbled. "I think it's important. Did you see the expressions on their faces?" Rudy asked. "They were scared," Rudy said, his voice going low. "Afraid to talk much. One of them said they were being hunted." "Ha," Fadi said. "What do they expect? It's a war. We're all combatants here, even the merchant ships." "That's true," Johann said sadly. "We must kill our fellow mariners to win this war. Then, if it's our time, we can go home." Hans thought, what would we say when we met our maker? That we were following orders? The boat waited at the pre-designated rendezvous coordinates for the supply ship's restocking of torpedoes and other essentials. The crew was kept busy with the many routine tasks of maintenance, operations, and testing, part of which involved quick certification dives to check for leaks that inevitably sprouted. During the dives, Hans dreaded hearing the hull's metal shrieking due to the enormous forces crushing against the ship. If the seawater pressure could compress the submarine's high-strength steel, what could it do to him if the ship imploded? The ship continued to complain like an old woman shuffling across the kitchen floor on a winter morning. In fact, it sounded like his beloved grandmother, Brunhilde, God rest her soul. Hans had been trained to know the sounds of the ship, so when he heard something new amidst the hull's normal groaning, popping and creaking, he was quick to investigate it. It was a rhythmic tinkling sound that traveled along the piping of the ship's water cooling system. He had to fix whatever was making the sound. An unexpected mechanical failure could potentially sink the boat. Also, excessive spurious noise was dangerous on the submarine. The enemy destroyers had hydrophones that could detect underwater sound. If they knew where they were, they could kill you. Listening carefully, he patiently tracked the sound towards its source, ducking and squeezing through crowded spaces full of machinery, support struts, and piping systems. It wasn't much different than working on the plumbing under his grandmother's sink back in Dresden, except now he rarely hit his head when he moved without thinking. The sound originated inside the main ballast area, a large hollow tank situated within the hulls underneath the control room. Inside the tank, a careful balance of air and water was maintained to raise and lower the ship's depths, and incidentally, it was used as a backup reserve for breathing air. There was also 4 other ballast tanks located outside of the hull, fore and aft, and along each side. Without sufficient air in the ballast tanks, the ship would sink like a weighted corpse. What the hell was that? It was almost like a glass bottle bouncing against metal. Perhaps one of the shipyard's fitters had left their stash of liquor in there? He'd have to tell Gruber about it. Gruber wouldn't be happy. The reasons behind mysterious sounds were elusive at times. They might not be able to repair this type of problem at sea. The supply ship never showed up. Schmidt decided to travel back to port. It was a disgraceful waste of diesel, but the ship needed torpedoes. Hans thought, even the Angel of Death has its limits. Still, the crew's morale was high. Back to merry Spain, where shore leave, booze and women awaited them, while the ship underwent an overhaul and torpedo reload. Then, the unthinkable happened. A man didn't show up at his workstation. The cook, Alfred, who was also an assistant electrician, hadn't been seen since last night. The crewmen methodically searched the ship, section by section, bulkhead door by bulkhead door. No one could slip past them. When the crew met up in the command center, Schmidt announced that the cook was nowhere to be found. Everyone was to keep a lookout for him. Where could he have gone while submerged under the sea? Gruber whispered something into Schmidt's ear. Schmidt looked at Hans, then said, "Prepare for ascent to surface. We need to recharge the air. While we're doing that, we'll check the internal ballast compartment. We probably have a sound short." The captain gave the command. The ship rose to periscope depth. Schmidt scanned the surrounding sea and gave the order to surface. Hans and another crewman, Dieter, were chosen to enter the main ballast tank. Hans' slight frame made it easier for him to squeeze through confined spaces, so he was regularly chosen for tasks like these. The tank's hatchway was unlocked and opened. After 10 minutes of letting the tank air out, they entered one at a time through the narrow hatchway. He took a final deep breath before submerging himself into the cloying darkness. The lights from their electric lanterns did little to dispel his anxiety. They split up, searching for the cause of the mysterious sound. Hans left behind the one-way in and out of this foul-smelling area, cramped with interconnecting metal supporting baffles, struts, and piping. Good thing the sea weather was relatively mild. It was difficult enough walking on the slippery surfaces without the boat rocking wildly. A few minutes later, Dieter yelped, not a typical sound that one would hear from a seasoned sailor. Hans moved towards his partner, stepping over and bending around obstructions until he got to where Dieter leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. Dieter's sickened expression said it all. Hans wasn't going to like this. He saw a head, just a head, no body. The head rolled with the shifting of the boat and kept hitting a pipe that passed through the wall structure. Mein Gott, his teeth. The teeth hit the pipe, making the tinkling noise. Hans shuddered. It was Alfred's head. Alfred, who had once told Hans how he missed his wife, his childhood sweetheart, and their 2 young girls, who would squeal with delight when he pushed them on their tire swing. Dieter trudged back to the hatchway to ask for direction on what to do next. Hans stood awkwardly in silence, his lantern light playing across what remained of his shipmate, knowing that the only access into that area, the hatchway, had been padlocked closed. How the hell did Alfred get in here? What the hell happened to him? They never found the rest of the body, so they once again submerged, traveling on a course back to port. Morale was low. Schmidt authorized a ration of schnapps for the crewmen, but the drink seemed to make everyone feel melancholy. Several hours later, loud noises started to bang intermittently against the outside length of the ship. Fatty joked with Hans, saying that the boat must be looking very sexy to some of the amorous whales in the region. Hans laughed nervously, knowing that wouldn't be a first in naval history, but it was highly unlikely. The noises continued to disturb everyone's sanity. Schmidt described the anomaly as a mechanical problem that would need to get fixed at a port shipyard. Then another person went missing. It was Grubbard, the ship's best navigator, last seen going to his bunk for a quick nap. Again, the crewmen went through the same drill. Grubbard couldn't be found, so after verifying that no other ship were in the area, the submarine was raised to the surface. When the top hatch was popped open, a brief waterfall of cold seawater spilled inside. The banging noise stopped. A storm had been brewing outside. Some crewmen were sent topside, tasked with inspecting the outside of the ship to see what had been causing the ruckus banging noises. Hans was called to duty again, along with Dieter, to search the main ballast tank. He dreaded going in there again. Will we find what's left of Gebbert? Sweating in the dark, even though the air was damp and chilly, Hans groped his way around cold metal and over slippery surfaces. The ship's rocking slowed his progress through the ballast tank. About halfway through his search, he heard the call to return to the hatchway. Schmidt wanted them to come see something. They were directed towards the torpedo room, where the nervous crewmen were assembled. What Hans saw shocked him to the core. It was Gebbert, strung up, suspended in midair, electrical wires woven deep into his flesh and connected to the piping overhead, looking like the sacrifice portrayed on the cross he wore around his neck. Gebbert's skin was a fish-white color. His waxy eyes were bugged out, and seawater still dripping from his body, obviously drowned, yet trussed up here before the group. They had searched this area not long ago. Impossible as it was, it must have happened recently. Mechanical problem, my ass! Schmidt took control of the paralyzing situation. Take him down, gently. Put him in the machine shop. Men, stay sharp. Go back to your stations. Make sure that we're running safe and secure. Then reassemble in a quarter of an hour at operations. We'll get to the bottom of this. Dismissed. He then motioned for his officers to confer with him, as if seeking counsel on what to do next. Hans was alarmed that the order wasn't given to submerge the ship. They were extremely vulnerable to the enemy on the surface. Then again, being below the waves had definitely proven to be lethal. Hans went back to the engine room with Gruber and Michael, the mechanist mate who assisted with engine repair. Gruber fussed with the diesels and electric motors. Of course, everything was operating perfectly. They were designed and manufactured by Germans, the best craftsmen in the world. Hans and Michael talked, faces close to each other, at the aft end of the engine room, near a diesel fuel storage tank, out of sight and earshot from Gruber. Are we being hunted as well? Michael asked softly, reminding Hans of what was said by sailors on the supply ship. I don't know. What could do this, and why? Michael was about to answer when he was suddenly jerked backwards into the inky shadows behind the storage tank. It was so quick that only impressions lingered with Hans. Michael's eyes bulging with surprise, a sudden whoosh of displaced air, and outstretched arms, the last thing Hans saw of him. No scream, no sound. Just a hallowed after-image of Michael. Hans hesitated, trembling, then reached forward into the darkness. Nothing there except the sticky bulkhead wall. There was blood coating his fingertips when he pulled his hand back. Gruber! He screamed like a frightened schoolgirl. Hans stared into the darkness, shivering and unmoving, for what seemed like an eternity. His body jerked at Gruber's touch. Gruber saw the blood and cursed. Michael! He's gone, Hans whispered. Something! He's gone! Hans! Gruber yelled. His grip on Hans' shoulder tightened. We need to leave, now! Hans snapped out of his mental fog. Just follow me, okay? Gruber said. Hans nodded. They bolted out of the engine room to the all-hands meeting. Not everyone was there yet. The men kept a wary distance from each other, no longer behaving as comrades, anxious with suspicious looks. Some glared at Hans when they saw the blood dripping from his hands. At this point, the pounding against the ship's hull had started again. Also, there were scratching noises like nails being drawn across the outer skin of the ship. The sounds unnerved the already tense crew. When Schmidt arrived, Gruber began. We lost Michael. Hans said that something. Schmidt gruffly said, That's enough, Gruber. Hans didn't know what was scarier. Schmidt's suddenly harsh voice, holding fast to his Prussian emotional control, or the knowing, frightened looks of the other crewmen staring back at him. Something happened to even more of the others. That's why everyone isn't here. There was a sudden flash to Hans' left. Others saw it happen too. Officer Wildmar was grabbed by something, a sky-blue, misty blur. There he was one moment, and gone the next, pulled through the metal lattice floor like cheese through a grater, drawn out of sight into the dark decks below. Nothing was left of the man except thin strands of ropey red-brown liquids that spilled into the darkness below. There was a brief stillness of awful silence. Then all hell broke loose. Screaming crewmen, mindless with terror, pushed and clawed each other in a raging chaos to escape until Schmidt's loud, commanding voice quickly brought the remainder of the panicked crew under disciplined control. Relieving, launch the lifeboats. Prepare to scuttle the boat. On my orders, move it! Shocked as they were by the unusual order, the crew instinctively knew that it was suicidal to remain on board, and, as one, they scrambled to complete their pre-assigned emergency tasks. Visibly shaking, Hans put on rain gear and helped lift one of the rectangular lifeboat packages up the top hatch ladder. The lifeboat was damned heavy, but he had the strength of adrenaline driving him. The weather topside rocked the boat from side to side, even with its heavy ballast. Wind whipped the nighttime waves to smash against the lower conning tower. Electric lantern lights lanced wildly into the rain-soaked deluge of Atlantic darkness. Sailors on the outside deck tried to deploy their rafts while holding onto tether ropes. The treacherous wave action almost made some lose their footing, making it more difficult. One raft was almost ready to go. He heard the sound of an airplane approaching fast from the outcast sky above. He glanced upward. It was probably an enemy dive bomber. What? No, not now. Hans' teeth chattered. The cold was brutal, especially after being inside the humid ship, but he'd also been traumatized by the insanity of recent events. With trembling hands, he and his partner gripped their section of the tether rope while they placed their lifeboat on the deck. They held the lifeboat package in place with their knees and, fumbling, started to undo the straps that held it together. Something heavy splashed nearby into the water, port side of the ship's aft end. Mein Gott, not a depth charge! The explosion was deafening, cracking against the ship with a huge wave that swept along the ship's surface. The wave slapped him hard, forcing salt water into his eyes and mouth. He lost hold of the tether rope as the boat began to list to one side. When he glanced along the ship's waterline, rising out of the rough sea, he saw a myriad of long, thick furrows cut into the metal, like claw marks gutting the belly of a dying beast. Overhead, the plane's engine roared away from the ship into the dark night. There was no scuttle charge detonation. The ship was sinking of its own accord, with help by a near hit from the depth charge. The ship rolled suddenly on its port side as it sank into the sea, throwing everyone off balance and flailing into torrential high-water waves. The cold gripped him mercilessly, squeezing the breath from him and sapping the heat from his shocked body. His heavy rain gear made it impossible to stay surfaced for long as tall waves and fierce undercurrents dashed him about and yanked him under repeatedly, forcing burning salt water down his nose and throat. Where's the raft? The raft! The raft! The raft was lost to his sight long ago in the endless swirling darkness and gurgle of struggling breathing from a great distance. He heard screams off and on when his head broke above the water for moments at a time. He knew he wouldn't last long. The salt water in his eyes distorted his vision, but he thought he saw a flicker of light. The raft. He was saved. The light was closer now, but it wasn't above the waves. It traveled below, moving swiftly, as if unaffected by the weather or waves. The spectral form of light glowed a pale blue, and more followed it, maybe several dozens of them, coming towards him. When he saw what they were, he knew that his time was at an end. The specters of foreign sailors had come to claim their vengeance.
Well, my little Luxes, I hope you enjoyed that scary story. But like I said, I had already told this one. This was a delightful one that I really enjoyed. And it's really creepy to me because anything that has anything to do with underwater horror is the scariest thing to me. So also reading about it will just make my imagination go berserk and freak me out. So I really hope you enjoyed this one. But thank you for coming and joining me around the campfire. And if you would like to follow me on my other social medias, there'll be a link in the description down below. That includes a link for my Etsy or for my Patreon, which greatly helps me if you come and join me on there or come and help me by purchasing some of my artwork. And on the screen, you can see a shout out to my fellow Patreon members, and thank you so much for joining me there. And a special shout out to my ultimate Lux. So thank you, Kurt. I greatly appreciate that you have joined me on my Patreon. And always remember to slay, subscribe, like, and always be yourself. And remember, I am the afterlife, the party, but I would love for you to come and join me in the afterlife, the party. And until next time, my little Luxes, I hope you stay spooky and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.